week on the show, we have Jack Lowe. Jack Lowe is a photographer that has embarked on a project that's taken him over 10 years and continues to grow. We are talking to him about his process, how he created the project, how he maintains the project, and how he funds the project, among many other topics. It's a really interesting chat. It's very frank and open in places, and I think everyone will be able to take something away from this.
We're also not really going to do much of an intro because the chat was decent. It was like almost an hour and a half long. So we're just going to twiddle our thumbs here for a couple of seconds and just jump straight into it. Here's Greg with the intro.
This week on the pod, we are delighted to be joined by Jack Lowe. Jack is a photographer who has been working for over a decade now on a personal project called the Lifeboat Station Project, which has involved him travelling around the UK, visiting various RNLI lifeboat stations and photographing some of the volunteers that work for that amazing organisation using an incredibly old photography technique, the wet plate collodion technique, I believe, but we'll hear more about that from Jack himself. Jack, welcome to the show. I guess we'd like to start really by kind of hearing a bit about your background and kind of your journey into photography, because I feel like it's quite an interesting one. You've worked in various capacities, haven't you, over the years?
I have, and thank you for having me on your podcast.
Oh, pleasure.
Yes, it's in many ways quite a cliched entry into photography, because my grandmother gave me my first camera when I was about 8-9 years old, a Kodak Instamatic, and that was her mother's camera. So my great grandmother's camera, and it was a ball that I ran with. I was soon captivated by well, let's rewind the clock to what it was like then. You'd shoot a film through a camera like that, and you'd take it to the chemist and wait 7 to 10 days, and you'd have your little paper slip that, as a young boy, I'd excitedly clutch and just make sure I had it and hadn't lost it. And then you'd go to the chemist and pick up the envelope of photographs and find that they're all rubbish. Improvement required. And remember the little oval stickers that are on the print sometimes?
Underexposed, police
quality
aware.
Control. Yeah. So some of them would have those stickers, and I'd be offended. But I'd gradually learn, and photography has been in my life ever since then. And I earned my first money from photography on school sports days, because I soon realised that the vain kids really love to have their picture taken as they're doing the high jump or crossing the running line, and I'd make sure I was there to get photographs, and then I would go home overnight to my bedroom that I converted into a dark room, and I'd process the films and make some contact sheets in my bedroom and take them in the next day and take orders. And I remember one day, I was probably about 14 years old, something like that. I came home with 50 quid of cash in my pocket.
Wow.
And I thought I'd made it. And actually, in many ways I had. I was buzzing. And
vanity's got a lot to answer for in a positive way, I think, for photographers.
Yes, you're not wrong. So I think that was my first professional stint at photography. And when I knew that, I knew from that early age that I always wanted to be a photographer. And I also knew from an early age that I wanted to be a lifeboatman as well, which is something that didn't happen in the end, but we can come back to that connection in a bit if you'd like. But yes, my first proper foray into professional photography was then assisting other photographers in London for a few years. And I assisted Jonathan Knowles, studio photographer in Hammersmith for a good 3 years, sort of from the mid to late 90s. And that's where I really learned what good business practice was all about. And then went out on my own and worked on my own as an advertising photographer. Some 23, 24 years ago now, and then had this huge tangent, which was completely by accident, of becoming a printmaker to other photographers, and then design groups and ad agencies and a retoucher and all of that kind of thing. And that was a good 12-year chapter in my life, that side of things. So it got to a point where I thought, hang on a minute, what's happened to my photography? The print table here is covered in other people's photographs that
Where
I've
am
been
I?
printing for them. Yeah, where are mine?
Right.
And I guess you could call it kind of a midlife correction. Thinking, right, and if I'm going to do something then with my own photography again, because I always had continued making photographs in the meantime, but I don't even like to say just for personal use, because that's the best bit of photography, I think, is doing it for yourself and making things that please you, and if they please other people as well, that's fantastic. But I then set to work thinking from about 2010, 2011 onwards, right, if I'm going to go back into photography, I need to throw myself into it wholeheartedly, and it needs to be something special, something that really brings something to the party. And that's when I started to look back to my childhood passions and think about that time as an 8-9-year-old, getting into photography with that Kodak Instamatic, and then my bedroom as a darkroom and all that magic I enjoyed then, and also a childhood passion for lifeboats as well. I was about 10 years old. I became a member of Stormforce, which is the junior membership club for the RNLI.
It rings a bell. I feel like I might have had a membership for that for a year or so.
Yeah,
Stormforce.
it was awesome. And that captivated me. We can come back to that if you like at some point, but just in the spirit of brevity at the minute, I was into other things too, like model railways and Lego and all that kind of thing. But I thought, photography, lifeboats, the sea, surely there's something to be made with that. And I wrote those 3 things down on a piece of paper, and you can see that on the website, on the about page at lifeboatstationproject.com, and yes, you can see what those 3 ideas look like. And it's very powerful. And that's a notion to come back to at some point as well, perhaps to encourage other people in how to think about their projects. But I didn't actually come up with the idea of what I was going to do with those 3 things straight away. It wasn't until a short while later when I realised we've got the famous tea towel, the RNLI tea towel with the map of all the lifeboat stations on it.
Right.
That's been on our kitchen wall for years. And I was at our kitchen table sipping from a cup of tea and suddenly saw it with fresh eyes, given what I'd just written on a piece of paper recently. And it dawned on me that I could visit every single RNLI lifeboat station and document them as one body of work. And because we have the wonders of the internet these days, I was able to do a bit of research to make sure that nobody else had done it, which they hadn't. And that was the twinklings of the Lifeboat Station Project.
Nice.
Wow. And this was in around 2000 and...
So I came up with the idea in October 2012. That's just nearly 11 years ago now. Coming up with the idea, and I proposed it to the RNLI, and it's been the source of ribbing ever since, because I was rejected at first. They turned me down. They said, "Well, no, we're doing something like this already. We were already working on an idea like this." And I was devastated. I had to really go away and lick my wounds. And the book that they were working on was then published. And it's a very good book. It's called Courage on Our Coasts, with the photography of Nigel Millard. And it's a great book. But I realised in those moments it wasn't what I was intending to do.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, I'd made the idea better by bringing in the notion of wet plate collodion, into the mix. And we can, that's a choice that's very specific and important to the project. And so I'd honed and refined the idea. And so in 2014, then, another couple of years had passed, I reproposed the idea to the RNLI. I pretended I hadn't before and that I hadn't been rejected before. And it landed with the same person by sheer chance. The email landed with the same person. And
nice to hear from you again.
Yes, well, yes. She said, "I remember you."
Oh, there we go.
And I think she might have liked my brazen approach. And she said, "You're right. This looks good. This does look good. Perhaps you should come down for a meeting." Mm-hmm. And so I went to the RNLI for a meeting. Now, I'm based in Newcastle upon Tyne. So that was a long drive down in my newly acquired, decommissioned NHS ambulance. And we can come on to the reasons for that in a bit too, I'm sure.
My God. I've just got why you've called it, the name you've called it. Amazing. Right, go on. We'll get to that, because that's, okay. That's amazing. Fantastic. Oh, Jack. Forever in my heart with that. Okay, cool. Right.
Yeah, there's a reason for everything, Tom. There's a reason for everything. Every single thing I do on the project, or everything I do in life, there's a reason for everything.
I love that. So you went down from Newcastle to the headquarters?
Yes, in Poole.
Oh, in Dorset.
Yeah.
Right. Wow.
I want to do an endorse it joke now.
Oh no!
After your sorry one earlier.
Please don't encourage
it's the best county you've ever known.
Jack, would you like a permanent spot on the podcast?
No.
Endorse it.
Have like one of those signs that says,
destination.
"Don't feed the birds," but it's "Don't encourage Tom."
Okay, I missed that sign somewhere. Anyway, yes.
So should we need to tell the listener though the name of the van now, because everyone's going to be, if they don't know.
Yes, she's called Nina, Neena.
As in Nina.
Exactly.
Nina.
Exactly.
I love it.
I
was doing an interview for BBC Radio Scotland a few years ago, up in Inverness, and the chap who's interviewing me said, "So tell me about the name of your vehicle. I mean, the name of your first love, or your wife, perhaps?" I said, "No, it's the sound ambulances make." And he just paused for a moment and was like, "Oh, I can't believe I just walked into that." So yes, I then all I wanted from the RNLI was their blessing in those moments to do it.
Right.
I didn't know if I wanted to be commissioned by anybody, or these were very early days, and I've learned such a lot since then about how to make such a vast project and how to go about funding it. What's a good idea? What's not a good idea? It's been
because it is a mammoth project, isn't it? I mean, so they've got 238 stations.
Yes,
is that
correct?
right?
Yes, 238. Okay. Yeah,
that's very good knowledge for some reason of mine, but almost like I've done some research. But that's a vast project, because how many are local to you? Did you do those ones first?
No, I'm saving those as a homecoming.
Oh, nice. Oh, good.
Yes, yeah. Do the nearest ones last, so that it's all a little bit easier towards the end.
Yep, fair enough.
As I say, like a home run, Sorry, what was the question?
Well, okay. So, I mean, my thing, as soon as we knew we were going to have you on, I was obviously fascinated. I love the project. I love the portraits. If you guys haven't seen the portraits, they are really magical. They are timeless, beautiful. It's such a lovely collection of work. But for me, I find you personally fascinating. I struggle to want to do the same shoot over 2 days. And personal work, I never do. I mean, I think the longest project I ever did was 2 weeks. I do, but it's quick hit. Like it's never like a long-term project. And this is like when Jack, when I knew you were going to come on, I had to talk to you about it. It's honestly been burning me up. But because how do you keep the drive?
Well, yeah, I'm very single-minded, and I hyper focus on things. It's a very distinct character trait of mine. And when I came up with this idea and knew how special it was and got it underway, that's cutting a long story short, just to say when I got it underway, that was quite a process in itself, to get to a stage where I was ready to work with such an ancient process on the road. It generated a life of its own, and it's the most beautiful thing. Thing is such an understatement, to use that word to describe it. It's so beautiful as an experience, not just for me, for everybody involved. And as I got better and better at the process and mastered it more and more, and was much more confident in what I could ask from the lifeboat volunteers, because I had the RNLI's blessing, and it was so powerful for them as a body of work that strengthens the signal of the work that they do. I just found that the further I went, the more cooperative people became, because they would start to write to me to say, when are you coming to our station? And isn't that just the best attitude to have from the people you're photographing and spending time with?
Absolutely.
That they are talking about it among themselves and then energized enough to write to me to say, when are you coming? And
no convincing necessary. They're excited to have you down. Right?
Yeah. So it went from a stage of me having to drive it. Mind you, that drive has always had to be there, I've found over the years. And it's it is undeniably one of the harder things in more recent times that have been difficult for other reasons. But yes, I am the driving force behind it. But there's been these wonderful years where it kind of pulled me along, and to answer the question about how have I been able to stay so focused on it and so driven by it, it's simply because it's the most beautiful thing, that I think I've ever made in terms of creative work. I'll describe it as my life's work.
Right.
At this stage in my life, I might get to 70 and look back and think, no, that wasn't your life's work. But, it's how I feel at the moment,
You're a long way from 70, so you'll be fine, don't worry.
Yes, yeah. And, when you're involved with such special people who, at the drop of a hat, are going to drop everything that they're doing and go to sea to save somebody they don't know, it leaves me speechless often, because I have actually seen it in action, of course, because I've been to so many lifeboat stations now. I've been to 158 lifeboat stations I've now documented, of those 238. That means that the odds are on that I'm going to see real life shouts, as they're called. And many of them have been just extraordinary, to see. There's one instance in Weston-super-Mare in Somerset, on a hot July evening, where we'd made all the photographs, and I was, it's a very physical process working with wet collodion. So I was slightly exhausted at the end of a hot day of working all day long, and then was chatting to the crew, who were still kind of kitted up from the crew photograph that we'd just made. And the pagers went off. They had these emergency pagers clipped to their belts. And we could see these two kids further along the promenade were in the water in quite a swell. And because they were kitted up already, this is something that's been common to the theme of the project too, that the lifeboat crew are often kitted up, so they save minutes on their launch time because they've just been photographed. And off they went and whipped up these young boy and a young girl who didn't know each other, I don't think. And they got back to the slipway just by Nina, where Nina was parked, running into the arms of their respective parents, having just been saved by the RNLI. One kid had kicked a football into the sea, and it's one of those it's high tide, and it's one of those promenades where it's got that scoop back on the concrete, so the waves are chucked back out to sea.
Yep.
And he jumped in to get his ball. So then there was no way out. And the little girl thought, I've just learned to swim. I know how to swim. I'll help him. And jumped in after him.
Wow.
And then, so to see that all happen within, I timed it. I just looked at my watch quickly to see what time it was that they went in. And so within 7 minutes, they were back on the slipway, having saved the lives of those 2 kids.
Amazing. And it's also probably worth noting that all of these guys who are going out and dropping everything and risking their lives, they're all volunteers.
Yes, yeah. The large proportion of them are.
Sure.
There are some full-timers at lifeboat stations. There are 2 types of lifeboat station. There are all-weather lifeboat stations and inshore lifeboat stations. The all-weather ones are the ones with the big boats, with the orange wheelhouses and the blue hulls. The inshore lifeboat stations are the ones with the smaller boats, like the inflatables and the ribs, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I actually got taken out by the RNLI in Port Isaac.
Oh, yes.
They took me out on a... Have you been down to Port Isaac?
Yeah, so they've got a D-class there, haven't they? A little boat.
Yeah, they took me out on it and really ragged it about and scared the living crap out of me.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever been so scared.
No, those boats, I've been to sea once on one of those boats, and I don't know how they do it, because it's a rough ride. Even and
that's a generous way of saying it.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, they're brutal. But they often call those D-class lifeboats the spine of the RNLI, because they do so many of the shouts, because they're so versatile.
And they can get really close to the shore, right? Because they're not at all deep. They can bring the motor up and float in.
Yeah, shallow
That's
draft.
right. Yeah. So at the all-weather lifeboat stations, there are full-timers. So the coxswain may well be a full-timer. He's the person in charge of the boat. And the mechanic is usually a full-timer to look after these multi-million-pound vessels. And, not least because the lifeboat can't go to sea without the mechanic on board. So they need to be keeping the boats in pristine condition at all times. So
that's a hell of a job, isn't it? They must have multiple mechanics then who rotate, because they can be called out at any point, right? You can't just finish a 12-hour shift and then go out to sea on a rescue.
No, that's right. There are often 2 or 3 mechanics at a station. One who might be a full timer. It just depends on the station, the location, what's possible, what's not possible.
Sure.
Yes, it always seems to be like a rolling work in progress in many ways. But incredible, whichever way you look at it, it's just phenomenal. I think it's over 5,000 volunteers on the coast.
Wow.
Proper.
Mm-hmm.
So to get back to the kind of origins of the project, you talked briefly about kind of choosing the wet plate process, the collodion process. What were your reasons for doing that? Did you have any experience with doing it before? And how did that if not, how did you learn to do it? Because it's a very involved process, from what I understand.
Yes, it really is. And this comes back to the hyperfocus trait.
Right.
Really. Okay, so I've already mentioned that I converted my bedroom into a darkroom when I was a kid. I did that when I was about 12 years old. And I taught myself how to, read books and things, taught myself how to process film and print from the negs. And I wanted to tap back into that magic of that feeling of seeing, it's a classic thing to say, I know, but it's true, to see the image appearing in the chemicals. And so in that period when I was licking my wounds about being rejected with my initial idea for the Lifeboat Station Project, I then started to think harder about it, and how could I keep pursuing this vein of something that's really special? There's a body of work that's something that's tangible in some way and that engages the lifeboat crews in more ways that, say, somebody turning up at a station to shoot it digitally might do it, and so I started to think back, not coming up with the idea. Not only had I thought back to my childhood passions, but as the idea progressed, I then started to think, well, what were the things that really lit my fire, floated my boat? And I then started to look into old photographic processes, and under the notion really of wanting to make photographs perhaps in the field that, at the lifeboat stations, that lifeboat crew could see me developing. It seemed quite a strange idea at the time, but it meant going back to almost to the dawn of photography, to 1851, and coincidentally seeing a video by Ian Rutter called Silver and Light, which he published in 2012. And he converted, I think, an old UPS van, a UPS parcel van, into a darkroom, but not only a darkroom, but a camera, and was making huge wet plates, with a big lens. In the end, he'd open the doors of the back of the van and put a lens there, and the back of the van would become the backboard, where you put a plate to expose a huge plate.
Wow.
And that was me then sparked and thought, right, I've got to learn this process. That's what I want to do. And that was a long journey in itself, learning how to make glass plates, or well, not just glass plates, but tin types. You can shoot on any kind of inert material as long as it doesn't interfere with the photographic process. So I learned first making tin types, which are the metal plates, but they're opaque. I mean, they're beautiful things, but because they're on metal, it means you're stuck with some of the physics of photography. It means that you can, when you're looking through the back of a field camera, the image is upside down and back to front. So you can sort out the vertical inversion right away by turning the plate up, the finished plate, the right way up. But you can't sort out the lateral inversion if the medium is opaque.
Right.
You're always stuck with an image that's back to front.
Hence using glass.
Exactly. Yeah. So then I knew that I couldn't make a project that, their life jackets, the boats, they say RNLI on them.
Yeah, it would all be gobbledygook.
It'd always be back to front, and you'd always have to answer the question, so why is it back to front? So then I realised you could then make photographs on glass, and that means then they're like a big slide that you can then sort out the lateral inversion by spinning the glass plate around. I'm doing it this size with my hands because that's the size of the pieces of glass that I kind of know that inside out now. They're almost the size of an album cover. They're 12 by 10 inches. And I then worked out what size I could practically use on the coast, from a mobile darkroom, because wet collodion dictates that you need to have darkroom facilities to hand. So if you're working on location at lifeboat stations, it means that you have to have a darkroom with you. And that could either be a tent, perhaps, that you set up each time, or perhaps it could be an interesting vehicle, like a decommissioned NHS ambulance, converted into a wet collodion darkroom. Called Nina, yes. Because, of course, when you're thinking about the size of the plates, you have to think about the size of the boxes that they're being carried in, the size of the trays for the chemicals, the size of your silver nitrate tank, the amount of chemicals you're able to carry. All of these things make a huge difference, because the surface area size, say between 8 by 10 and 12 by 10, is huge. Even though they sound like they're quite similar, they're not at all. And everything changes, so you have to be really methodical from the outset in your approach to using wet collodion. And these are the things I came to realize as I was learning how to do it. So again, to answer that question, I'd watch YouTube videos, I'd read old manuals. There were 3 relatively modern manuals on the topic. I bought them all, read them all, and realized that with this process, you can't actually, whatever anybody says, you can't just go with one manual and that's your answer. You have to absorb as much information as you can and almost take an average and then add in your own experiences into the mix. And so my manual, if I wrote a manual, it'd be very different to any of those 3. Because of the things that I've learned by making so many glass plates under so many different weather conditions and circumstances.
I mean, how many have you made, do you think? Do you know?
Well, I think there are about 700 finished glass images on the website now. And to arrive at those and through all my learning process and things, I think I've probably made a good couple of thousand glass plates, something like that.
Wow. You talked about adverse weather conditions. Now, the weather obviously changes the process and the amount of chemical. Is it the amount of chemicals you need, or is it in the amount of time involved in developing the images? Or
Well, it requires chemical reactions to take place,
right?
because it's an analog process.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about darkroom conditions you might have in a purpose-built room in a building, you'd have very carefully controlled temperature baths and all of that kind of thing, that are keeping your chemicals and everything at the right temperature. So if you're then working on the coast with a process that also requires that kind of control, or in an ideal world, it means that you're at the hands of the elements.
Right.
Because, one of the common things that people might say is, if it's so freezing cold outside, why didn't you make your darkroom warmer by having a heater running inside it? But the thing is, if you go from one temperature, if you carry a wet plate, remember that's why the process is called wet plate, because the plate has to be wet to make a photograph. This is another logistical consideration. Once you've handmade the glass plate, moments before you're ready to make the photograph, you're on the timer. You've got about 10 to 15 minutes to complete the whole process.
Right.
So that includes carrying the glass plate to wherever the camera is, which could be at the end of a 250-meter pier, for example, to put on the back of the camera that's waiting there, expose the plate, march back to the darkroom and to develop it, all within 10 to 15 minutes. The temperature, the ambient temperature plays a big role in that. And then not only that, it plays a big role in how fast the developer acts on the exposed plate. All of these things. And so one of the best things I learned to do quite early on was to stop measuring things, to stop trying to be really rigorous, as I might have been in my digital printmaking days, working with computers and retouching and all that side of life, to really rediscover my analog side and let go of measuring everything. I mean, obviously I had to measure chemicals and that kind of thing, to make sure that the proportions were correct. But when it comes to timing and things, just to release yourself to feeling and to what you're observing and smelling, all of these different things come into play to make sure that you're that you end up with a fantastic glass plate. It's quite thrilling.
Yeah,
No, I can imagine.
How, on average, how long would an exposure be? Are we talking? I mean, you're shooting with a field camera, so you setting your aperture to what would you tend to use for your pictures? Do you have to use a certain?
Well, yes. I don't know if this will answer your question or not, but when it comes to exposure times, I listen to my heart, and it's amazing again when you stop measuring things, because remember, with a 12 by 10 inch camera and such a slow process. I mean, we haven't even discussed the sensitivity of the plates yet. There are three things, aren't there, that come into play with exposure. There's people often say shutter speed and aperture.
Yeah, and then your ISO.
But then the sensitivity of the medium that you're recording on. So with fresh collodion, the ISO is about 0.75.
0.75.
Yeah, and as the collodion ages a little bit, probably goes down to 0.5.
Okay,
Wow.
So
that's a lot of light you need.
Yeah, so on a bright sunny day, which I hate, by the way, I can't stand working on a bright sunny day with direct sunshine. Very, very hard. Makes a hard work process even harder work. But let's just take that as an example, because I'll always remember my granddad when he was teaching me, because he was a keen amateur photographer, which was part of my route into photography as well. But my first SLR was a Praktica L2, which didn't have a light meter. And he gave that to me on my 12th birthday and said, all you need to know is a bright sunny day with 100 ISO film loaded in it is, what did he say?
16.
Sunny 16?
I think he said
Sunny 16.
Yeah. But I think he said to me f22 at 500th of a second. And so I had to just take everything from there and work it all out. He was quite grumpy, and so he didn't want to give me too much information because he didn't want me to be too successful,
Right.
He might be turning in his grave right now.
I'm not bitter. So I took everything from there. In those days, lots of trips backwards and forwards to the chemist and working out what was what when I was shooting colour film. And that's actually one of the reasons why I got into black and white processing, so that I could work it out pretty much immediately, without in the absence of a light meter. So, taking that same kind of mentality, I did used to use an app on my iPhone called Pinhole Assist in those early days of Wet Collodion and the project, which gives you really slow ISOs and kind of gives you a clue as to what direction you should be going in. And then a friend came to assist me, who's one of the people who helped me learn to use Wet Collodion as well. And he said, what are you doing with that phone? I said, well, I'm taking a light meter reading as best as I can. He said, do you know what the exposure will be? I said, do I? He said, yeah. Tell me now what the exposure will be. I said, I don't know, probably about F32, 6 elephants. Just with such a slow process that we're into the realms of elephants for our standard unit of exposure measurement. And he said, there you go, make the plate, just do it. And I did it, and it was absolutely spot on. And
Really?
from those moments, I never measured it again. And I became more and more accurate as the years rolled by. And again, remember, using this camera and such a slow process, there's no shutter as such. The shutter is my lens cap.
Right.
So I have to remove the lens cap very carefully, to keep the camera steady, and count the elephants in my head. And that's how I work it out, Greg, to answer that original question.
Wow.
Ages ago. It feels like you asked that now. But and it's literally a case of feeling what the day is like, and as the day gets going, I feel like I can look up into the sky and look and feel the brightness of light reflecting all around me, say on the concrete aprons that are in front of the lifeboat stations and things, and just with experience you gradually get to know, and that in a way is a really thrilling experience in itself, and it's impressive as well. When people see this beautiful 12 by 10 inch glass plate moments later and they go, hang on a minute, where's your light meter? Like, you say it's in here, it's in my heart. And they're just amazed because it looks magical, and it is magical. It is a magical thing.
How does it compare to the type of photography you were doing before? Did you used to work in a medium where you were quite kind of static and slow? Because obviously with this, you're on a tripod, you've got your field camera, you've got your hood over your head, I imagine. And because of the process of having to go to the van, prepare the wet plate, you've got to have it all clear in your head and position everyone how they want to be, and then be like, okay, try not to move too much. I'm going to be back in a minute with the negative, whatever, the plate.
Yes.
So it's very considered. It's very, arranged. Was that similar to the way you worked before, or did you have to learn this as a new skill? Did you have to come up with a completely different approach when you're shooting in this way?
Well, yeah, I mean, back in, when I was working in that studio in London, we were working with 5x4 Sinars, doing still life and portraits. And so that's a very methodical way of working there. So I kind of learned that practice there. And when I went out on my own as a photographer, I was working with a 5x4 Wister film camera. And so I never really worked digitally with photography, because remember, then I went into that period of being a printmaker, that was digital. So photography-wise, I think it's all I've ever really known, bizarrely, even in this modern age, is working with very traditional methods. And it's not by design or anything, it's just what I like to do. It's what I like about photography. Well, one of the things I like about photography. That's a whole other topic in itself, quite frankly, and maybe we'll come to that in a bit. Who knows? But yes, you're right. It's very, very methodical, and you have to be very organised in your mind, not only with the darkroom and the process, but also with the people. Because anybody who's ever photographed a group of people will know it's like herding cats at the best of times.
Oh God, yeah, especially when they start talking when you're taking the picture, and you're like, they
yes.
think if they do this outside their mouth, it's not going to come out in the picture.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Stop it.
And so when you then bring wet collodion into the mix, and then sometimes you're left thinking, what on earth am I doing? But again, I learned that if I'm just open and direct with the lifeboat crews, or whoever I'm photographing, spend the time briefing people beforehand. Spend the time speaking to them beforehand, and that actually, do you know that it may sound strange to say, but the camera almost becomes the least of it. It's being a people person is the most important part of it. And you might see, on the website, there's a behind the scenes gallery, and you can see pictures of me, some of which are briefing crews. I'm standing in some rather epic scenes sometimes, speaking to the lifeboat crews so that they know what to expect, and they know that when I come back from Nina carrying a plate holder that I'm going to plug on the back of the camera, that's the time when I need their full undivided attention, and we need to get it right. And if we don't get it right, that likely means another half an hour while I go and make another glass plate to try again. And
it brings the ceremony back into photography in a way, doesn't it? Because nowadays it's so easy to take a digital picture that it's become this kind of throwaway thing. It doesn't feel special to a lot of people anymore, and the process of even having a portrait taken doesn't really feel special. But even if you go and when I shoot sometimes on a rolly cord, even that, which is not a particularly complicated process, it's still film, but because of it being a camera from the 1960s and it looks old to people, that's all they know, is that it looks different to most things. So even that gets you a different type of portrait than if I were taking the same picture with my SLR or my mirrorless, because you're creating something. It feels more special. People feel more like there's a collaborative process, that they should shut up and be involved in a way. Don't mean in that in a crass way, but
no, you're quite right.
It's that sense of this is a special moment. And to turn up with a wet plate collodion with a van that's required, and the fact that you said the process takes this amount of time, no wonder there are people saying, well, when are you going to come and photograph us? Because we want to be part of this amazing magical process. And I think nowadays the magic of photography that you've talked about, seeing the image develop in the developer, most photographers that I know of our generation who've ever worked in a darkroom, that was the moment that really sealed the deal. Seeing that image appear in the developer is just, you just can't.
It's magic.
It is magic, and I do wonder if that is going to be forgotten and lost in the kind of, as process continues to become more and more digital.
Yeah,
but anyway, there's not really a question to that. I just love the idea that.
Well, on that note, really, and this again, I don't mean to to start every sentence with "this may sound strange," but this may sound strange. I don't really. There's understandably a lot of weight put on the glass plates as objects and things, because obviously it's usually the way that people access the project, by seeing these glass plates online, the digital version of them, and becoming engrossed from that point. But really, those glass plates are mementos of very special occasions. So we've all had a really excellent time together, and it's usually a very bonding time for the lifeboat station, because it may be the first time in a while that all the crew have met together. Say on training day, not everybody can make training days, or it might be on holidays or whatever, but we've always chosen a time when everyone might be available. And so they can be very special experiences just from that aspect alone, to see so many people gathered at the lifeboat station. There are several photographs where we have the big all-weather lifeboat with people dotted all over them. So there might be 30 people there on one of these huge lifeboats. So what an occasion! And And then there's the social aspect as well. We might go out to the pub later on in the day, or might have been out to the pub the previous night, something like that. We've all got to know each other a little bit. And that's, and again, another aspect of the process. It slows everything down. You have to take your time. I need to arrive at the station the day before, which means I often meet people the night before and already start to get to know them. It means that they trust you. They trust you with what you're doing, and they've seen what's gone before over the years, and they know, well, hopefully, that you're not a fool, and you're trying to shine a light on them to show what they are doing for humanity. And so in the context of that, strangely, the glass plate really just becomes a memento, a very special memento, admittedly, of this wonderful human interaction that's bonded people, and really it's given people special memories that I know that many of them still talk about today and will carry for the rest of their days. That's for me is the really special part of it.
Yeah.
But not to belittle the plates at all or take anything away from them, but that is the really special part of the memories and the stories to tell.
Okay, well, to totally ride roughshod over that, because that is a beautiful sentiment. How do you, from a techie point of view, how do you then go about digitizing them for the kind of, the benefit, the fact you're taking this memento, which is, a glass plate, which I've never seen one in the flesh myself, so it sounds amazing, but then to actually make that into something that you can print and distribute and allow people to own, how do you go about doing that?
Well, sometimes in life you wonder why you're doing something and then you find out the answers later, a few years down the line. I really did wonder for a lot of years why I'd gone on this particular tangent with retouching and scanning and printmaking, but then found out down the line that the Lifeboat Station Project would be the thing that encapsulates all of those skills I'd learned over the previous decade. So there's a whole side of the industry that knows me from that side of life, and those skills that I had mastered. And because the plates are big, they're, as we now know, 12 by 10 inches. That means you need a big scanner. So I've still got a scanner that I'd always hankered after years ago. It's a Fuji Lenovia, quite an old beast of a thing. But I scan the plates on that. It's an A3 scanner. It's a Fuji Lenovia C550. I think it was built, when you look at the production plate on it, in 1998. And I remember Metro Imaging having one in London, and they were proudly sort of saying about, I think it cost £40,000 or something at the time. So I bought a reconditioned one years later, just to be open about it. I think it's like £1,800 or £2,000, something like that. All those years later, but it still obviously is a great scanner and produces fantastic results. So that's how I scan all those glass plates on this A3 beast of a machine. I love to give everything, as much as possible, a new lease of life. I like to reuse things and upcycle things wherever possible. So hence the ambulance. I love that the ambulance now has a new story. The camera that I use is 1905. The scanner I use is still an excellent piece of kit. My main workstation in my studio is still a PowerPC G5 running OS X 10.4, which I think is Tiger. Because it still works, and it still earns me the same amount of money.
Yeah, can't argue with that.
Yeah, there obviously are compatibility issues sometimes, but that's where my laptop comes in. To join those dots, and I can't bear to upgrade things unnecessarily, or I love to keep things going or give things a new life wherever possible. So yeah, same with this. Even with the scanner, that story is true.
Is there somewhere?
Yeah, sorry.
With your ambulance, I mean, obviously, when you converted that, talk us through a little bit about the ambulance and then what you needed to have in there to make it work for you.
Well, the beautiful thing about the ambulance is that it's pretty much all you need already for a wet collodion darkroom, because you don't need enlargers or anything like that. All you essentially need to do is black it out and put a sink in it and red safe lights, because you can. The process is very insensitive to the red end of the spectrum. It's most sensitive to blues and ultraviolets. That end of the spectrum.
Right.
So it sees the world differently to how we observe the world, which is why.
Is that why skin tones look different?
Yes. Yeah. So it's why they do look. For many people, they can't quite put their finger on why the plates look so special. It's because it is seeing the world in a different way to how we see it. So it's a different response on the plates. And so with Nina, it was actually a very simple conversion. And I commissioned a darkroom company to install. We took out one of the chairs and put a chemical worktop and sink in there. And it's quite a straightforward process, to be honest, because she's essentially already a mobile lab. And the inspiration for that, when I was trying to think of what vehicle I might have or use, I originally thought maybe a horse box or something like that, or those vehicles that have accommodation and that they use for motocross, where they're like half workshop, half accommodation. But soon realised that they weren't quite the thing. And then a friend said to me, "What about a Land Rover ambulance?" I thought, "Oh yeah, well that sounds exciting." Then of course, they're really expensive. And then thinking about not only expensive to acquire, but expensive to run.
Yeah.
And I thought, what about because I was looking on eBay, what if I just type in ambulance? And top of the list was Nina.
There she was.
And there she was. And it's one of those moments where I just knew that she'd be in my life. And, well, just to flesh out that story a little bit, I didn't quite have the courage to run with it. I couldn't imagine myself owning a 3.5-ton ambulance. Because it felt so ridiculous. And I was kicking myself when it had sold. And I thought, I should have gone for it. What was I thinking? And then about a week or two later, eBay send you those emails that say an item you've been watching has been relisted.
Yeah.
And that floated in for Nina. I was like, okay, I've got to take this as a signal now.
Was meant to be.
Exactly. And so went for it. And she was for sale in Cheltenham. So got the train down to Cheltenham and picked her up and drove her back.
Wow.
How many miles did she have when you bought her?
234,000. How
many miles now?
About 276,000, something like that.
Okay.
So it's not maybe as much as you think, but bear in mind that the journeys are very focused. You're driving to one point, driving a few stations up the coast, driving back. And Newcastle is really well placed centrally in the UK for Shetland, the South Coast. So the miles, it's... So what's that? That's just about 40,000 miles. But very considered journeys.
Right. Oh, that's proper. I know how long I used to drive bands on tours years and years ago. I know how long those journeys can be in a big, heavy vehicle. Do you often get there and just completely exhausted from the drive?
Yeah, quite often. She's very comfortable and very easy to drive. She kind of almost drives herself.
Do you still have the lights on the top? Are you ever tempted to?
Maybe.
Blue light your way there.
Maybe. No comment.
I mean, obviously this is, a huge thing to take on an ambulance and turn this into your mobile dark room. The chemicals, I mean, we've not even gone into that of how you source them and where you source them from and how easy that is and how much they cost. I mean, the thing that will be coming to everyone's mind is that doing a project like this, not only is it a huge commitment personally, but it's also a huge financial commitment. How have you gone about kind of funding it? How have you found that process? Because I imagine it's changed a little bit in the 10 years plus that you've been doing this project.
Yes, yeah, it really has. Do you remember a little while ago I mentioned that I didn't know whether I wanted to be commissioned by anybody or commissioned by the RNLI or I had this pure notion, which I think comes over every photographer at some stage in their lives, that I was going to make beautiful work and sell prints of it, and that would fund it. I have to say that did actually happen to an extent. I was really proud of I still am really proud of the print sales that I've had on the project. But what I found was the print sales were covering the costs, but where was the living?
Right.
And to be open and blunt about it, I was getting into financial bother at times because I couldn't quite make the dots. I couldn't quite join the dots with it. And it was, this is cutting a very long story short. It was in 2017 when I reached my 100th lifeboat station at Valencia on the west coast of Ireland. The RNLI wanted me to do a piece to camera to mark the occasion, and my friend who was with me at the time was filming it, and I just couldn't get it right because I was so stressed. Underneath it all, I got to this point and I came a little bit undone, and I eventually managed to do this take. But there's a clip that I often show people in my talks just to talk about the mental health side of things. That yes, there can be this glossy facade on social media, but these things don't appear free of charge, And that's when I decided to, I guess, become quite activist about it, because I had, again, I thought maybe in those early days I wanted corporate sponsorship or something like that. But then I realized I was working so hard and it had become so special to me, I didn't really want my project to be associated with a corporation. And actually, the way I've gone over the years, I definitely don't want any kind of corporate involvement with my special project and these special people, because there's no hiding from it. They want their pound of flesh. And which company are you ever going to choose that's squeaky clean, or the company that's going to choose you? But again, a whole other topic. So I really thought about it, and it coincided again with a friend saying to me, "Have you heard of Patreon?" And at the time, Patreon was barely heard of. And for those that don't know, I guess many of us do know now, though, that Patreon is a crowdfunding platform that enables whoever supports you or likes what you do in whatever field you're in, they're able to pay you an amount of money on a monthly basis to help you make that work.
We never talk about that on this show, actually. We never mentioned that you can sign up at patreon.com/The Exposed Negative.
Oh, I see. Yes, that's right. I've seen a link for you guys.
Yes. No, so we completely agree. Patreon's amazing. It's so is that where you decided to land?
Well, that's what I did. Yeah, and I used it intensively for 3 years, and it changed everything.
Wow.
And when I was saying about being activist, what I mean by that is turning things around and reminding my audience unashamedly, like, look, you might have got used to being entertained free of charge by artists on these amazing platforms.
But this is how much it costs.
Yeah, but you must know that I've been at my wit's end and nearly lost my home over this project. And that's not me just saying that, by the way. That's I mean, on more than one occasion, really nearly lost my home. It's been very, very difficult. But Patreon did change everything, because then it gave me the living side. And once you offer people a way to let them support you, you're not telling them to support you, you're letting them support you. Many people jumped at the chance, and before too long, I instantly had over 100 patrons. I thought, oh, God, they've just been waiting there to help me in whichever way
Wow.
they can. I've always had a page on my website called Become a Supporter, where people can make one-off donations, and that's helped in many ways. But one of the things I changed on that page, even, it used to be amounts of money, but when I changed it to, when you click the button, or you see the button, rather than saying £1, £2, I changed it to a cup of coffee. So this is before websites that we know now, like coffee.com. Is it called coffee.com?
Or buy me a coffee.
Yeah,
or buy
coffee
me-
jar or
yeah.
yeah.
So before they came along, even I'd kind of clocked this. I thought, yes, you need to make people, like the photography itself, make them feel something, make them understand what they'd be contributing to. One of the biggest things that people click on is a tank of fuel for Nina.
I was going to say that's
Really? Yeah, right.
Yes, it's one of the most expensive. Because yes, there's a coffee for a couple of quid. I've got a pint of beer on there for £4. I mean, that needs updating. But
I was going to say, it's 2023. It's £1,700 at the minute.
Exactly. But the tank of fuel for Nina seems to be the most engaging one of all. And for many years, it was £85, and now it's like £160 or something like that.
Wow.
But which is how much it costs. But people still have been clicking on it over the years because it's just something they can instantly engage with,
Yeah.
So yes, use Patreon for 3 years. But I know you guys use Patreon, but I found one of the things that more patrons I got, so I ended up with over 300 patrons by the time I stopped using the platform. It became very expensive. It then highlighted, because of the amount of money you received versus how much was coming in, it highlighted how much they were taking. And on the face of it, it looks like, oh, but it's only this much. I think it was 5% or something like that. I can't remember what the amount was. But then there were these other charges for this and this and this. And it became like hundreds of dollars a month, the charges. And I thought, if my patrons knew that this amount was immediately just going to the platform, they'd be upset by that.
Sure.
And it's at a time when I was questioning big platforms altogether. I was questioning Facebook, Instagram, and not just the ethics of the platforms, but the efficacy of the platforms and the vanity of it. I had about 23,000 followers on Instagram, but when I dug a little deeper during the pandemic, when the pandemic started, it gave me a chance, as it did for many of us in life, to pause and reflect and really look at the efficacy of things and what we were doing. I realized that, although I'd love to tell people that I had 23,000 followers on Instagram, I realized that about 10 to 11,000 of those accounts were bot spam accounts. So instantly there's that much vanity just wiped away. And when you start to dig into who has actually clicked through on a post, or if you've changed your profile link so they can click through on something to actually take an action on that, how many people have actually done that? And the answer was not many at all for all those hours spent on social media. So I realized that the most effective of all, even though I didn't like it as much as at the time, was Twitter. And don't think of Twitter as it is now. Think of it as it was then.
In its heyday.
Yeah, in its heyday. And I made an announcement. I wrote a blog post about it, which you can still see on lifeboatstationproject.com, called A Social Dilemma. And then actually later that year in 2020, a film came out called The Social Dilemma, which is essentially around the same topic. And it's stuff that I'm quite belligerent about. I was told by lots of people how mad I was and silly I was, but I just looked at the numbers and thought, I can't keep putting hours into this. And when it came to, so I made that step and we got to one of the lockdowns in November 2020, I then questioned Patreon more, as well as one of these big dominant platforms like Facebook and Instagram. And I realized that they'd been shutting down accounts that didn't align with their own political values. And I thought, well, if you're at the behest of a platform as to whether or not they like you, and you could lose a whole following there, I just started to are starting more and more to go down an independent route of being the goalposts,
Yeah.
of being in charge of my own comms wherever possible, which I was already doing with newsletters. And that I can consider newsletters to be like my gold-plated. They're my gold-plated people. But I thought, hang on a minute, I've stepped away from these big platforms. I could surely build my own membership platform in these lockdowns where we've got more time to think and work out new things. So that's what I did. I worked out how to incorporate a membership platform into lifeboatstationproject.com. I called it the LSP Society, the Lifeboat Station Project Society, and then set about migrating everyone away from Patreon. And the fees were much, much lower. I found that the costs of running that were the annual cost was the same as the monthly cost through Patreon.
Wow.
And I found I got new patrons because they didn't want to go onto a new big platform. They liked that it was all incorporated within my website and had the look and feel of Jack Lowe and the Lifeboat Station Project. And that went from strength to strength, basically, and combined with print sales and other merch sales, because I sell postcard packs, and at times I sold mugs as well, and a key ring I've sold has been really, really popular over the years. I've just tried to offer people different access points, and people who pay £1 through the LSP Society get the same as somebody who pays £50, because I try and keep it as accessible to all as possible. Back in my Patreon days, I used to have tiers of access, and that became quite a nightmare in terms of administration and keeping on top of things. And I realised then the person who's paying £1 a month is probably finding it more difficult to pay the pound than somebody who pays £50 a month. So why should they get any different? Just pay what you'd like to pay, whatever you see fit. And that's how it's all built. So it's really built around community. And then we came to another lockdown. I thought, hang on a minute. People said to me, and I laughed it off at the time, Jack, you should build your own social platform. And I laughed it off and I left Facebook and Instagram thinking, yeah, right. I thought, no, hang on a minute. I've built a membership platform. Maybe I can get my head around building a social platform. And that's what I did. I then built a social platform within the website and an app. So there's now an LSP Society app that's been it's probably about 2 years old now, where my patrons used to be able to communicate directly with me, but now they've been able to connect together. So it's become this lovely community of people that have been brought together over the years. Sorry, there's always a lot for me. There's so many layers to this onion.
No, great.
That's
I'm
lovely.
making a checklist for things for Tom to get on top of. So it's we need a exposed negative society and an app, please, Tom.
Well, just as a warning, the app is not straightforward.
No,
it was nearly the end of me. When you realise you have to become a Google developer and an Apple developer, and make those accounts and work with and adopt that mindset. Oh gosh, it was daunting, but I got there in the end.
It's not for me. It's not for me.
No, you have to. Like the project itself, I had to go into it wholeheartedly, and I can only do it because there's yet another lockdown at the time, and I couldn't believe how complex it was. Yeah,
I can imagine.
And I guess, obviously at the moment, there is still. We are living through these kind of increasingly expensive years, and how have you found that in terms of the effects it's had on the project and sustaining it? Because you're not yet finished.
no,
To circle back to what we discussed earlier, there must be times when you are feeling more positive about the project and times when you're feeling less positive about the project, or at least within yourself in terms of the motivation and reasons. And do you have any kind of techniques or things that you've had to put into practice to try and break away from it and re-energize and refocus?
Yeah. Given everything we've said so far, which I now see is well over an hour. um, the project is an amazing, wonderful thing, but one of the most heartbreaking things about it, for me, has been the global circumstances. It was all I could do to survive the 2 years of the pandemic, because the 16th of March 2020 is a very finite moment for me, because the RNLI phoned me just as I was down on the south coast in Devon to say, Jack, you have to stop. So having been on the coast for a 10-day stint to that point, I then just had to drive back home to Newcastle. And I wasn't allowed to visit another lifeboat station for 2 years. And I worked out ways to adapt, and I made giant posters of my work, made outdoor exhibitions of my work in the form of giant posters. So learnt another skill there, and got my scaffolding ticket so that I could legally scaffold in public places.
Wow.
But I got through that because I still had a lot of drive and energy. But again, to be open about it, this last year has been the hardest of all of them, because I think there's a notion sometimes that the pandemic's over, so we can just carry on as normal. And that is the most exhausting sentiment I find, when people are pretending it's business as usual.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that it's a very expensive time, but I think the thing that isn't often discussed is I speak for myself, but again, going back to private conversations with artists and things, the difference between what they say publicly and what they'd say to you behind the scenes, is the drop in income. My income over the last year or so has been hammered, because quite frankly, limited edition prints from an albeit beautiful project don't become the first priority, I guess. And so not only it's a lethal combination that things become more expensive and income falls.
Yes.
And it's all I can do at the moment, just to keep kind of bumping along hour by hour, day by day. That's the stage I'm at the moment, is doing that. And to be honest, it's been kind of interspersed with other things like moving studio, which has been huge for me, because I've been for 20 years, I was in one place, and it's on the first floor. Carrying the glass plates to the new place, that was 80 trips up and down the stairs just for the glass plates, let alone the machinery and furniture and all that kind of thing. So it's been a very, very difficult time, and a heartbreaking time. And it's one of the reasons, you'll know full well that it's taken a few months to pin down us having this conversation. And part of the reason for that is because I knew it would be a little bit heartbreaking for me on a level, because of grieving for lost expectations, I think, is the best way I can word it at the moment. I'm not saying that that it's done or I can't do any more on the project, because I do want to see it through. But at the moment, there's no shying away from the fact that with things being so expensive and income falling so much, it's like, how can I'm running out of ways to magic this back into action. And I wanted to talk about it with you, because I hope it might help anybody who's listening who might be going through a similar thing but haven't felt brave enough to discuss it, or think it might just be them and are feeling isolated because of that. But I feel like I want people to know that they are not alone, because I'm not just talking about my experience. I know other artists who are feeling exactly like this, some even worse, but don't feel brave enough to talk about it publicly. And I don't think that helps anyone.
No, well, again, that goes right back to the kind of the reason we started this podcast in the first place, is to make sure that people are aware that things like this are going on, and that people don't feel alone. I know, running this podcast, we speak to hundreds of photographers, not as guests, but just people who reach out to us and say, how's it going? Love the podcast, etc., etc. I'm hearing pretty much across the board that everyone's having a tough year, like a really tough year, tougher than COVID. Everyone is just, not only is it been coupled with everyone's having a tough year, incomes are down, but people's resilience has been so battered after the 2 years since the pandemic, then actually there's a lot of people who are just like feeling not hopeless. Hopeless is really not the right word, but feeling really dejected and really low. And it's not because of their work, and it's not because of what they're producing. It's not because their marketing isn't working. It's because this is a global turndown, and this is happening to pretty much everyone I'm speaking to. So thank you so much for being so open and completely transparent with it. We're all having a hard time, absolutely. I do, however, want to will you on to do it. You have to see this project through.
Well, I'll always do my best, and I feel, sometimes to join the dots a little bit. I've been doing little bits of print work again, just to make sure we can still keep our home, back to that kind of stage again, and to keep the wheels turning. But I don't know about you, but I find it harder. It was only in 2019 that we would be able to say, in a few years' time, we have to do this and this and this.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas now I can't think ahead of more than a few weeks at a time.
Yeah.
It's hard to picture, even if we just take the headlines in our news apps or whatever or wherever we happen to catch our news. Today's quite a good example. I opened up my news app and thought, oh my goodness, with the things that are going on just today alone. And it's hard to know. I personally find it hard to hold on to a vision for a few years' time in the way that I used to. Like, I had this whole project mapped out in front of me, and it feels like 2022 and 2023 erased that framework that I once knew. And I've been trying to work out ever since what this new framework is. And I'm somebody who is so, as maybe you could tell, driven and focused and single-minded. Yet I feel like day to day I'm trying to now work out what on earth is this new landscape. Is there a landscape within which to operate? It's tough. And you may have seen the article recently, I think it was across the board, it was reported about a third of London artists can no longer afford their studio rent.
I saw this, yeah.
And it's the arts that go first. And I think that's a great sadness, because can you imagine a world without arts and culture? I can't. That's what carries people through. Yes, exactly. And it's what carries people through.
Yeah.
And I tip my hat to people who are able to operate as they once did and or keep making great work, because I've actually had to take a back seat for a moment and just give myself the space not to have that pressure, because it's the only way I can cope, because of this sense of grieving for lost expectations that I mentioned earlier on, And if you don't know what I mean by that, I mean, I was meant to complete the project in 2022.
Right.
Had everything gone to plan, I would have finished in September last year. And I'll now be at the stage of the glorious, huge tome of a book and the exhibition and the touring exhibition and all those things. And now I'm just going step by step just to work out what's possible when it's possible. And I know that's a bit of a buzzkill maybe, but I think it's so important to be open about it and honest about it, so that we all know what we're dealing with and that we're not alone in these things.
No,
100%.
absolutely.
100%.
Absolutely, completely. And thank you for being so open.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people will be, I was going to say happy to hear that. That's totally the wrong phrase, but like,
Greg, our listeners are not that nasty. That's unfair.
Yeah, a bit of Schadenfreude. No, it's. I think it's just that there's a lot of. It's a very solitary career what we do, and I'm not a massive fan of the term creatives, but as creatives in inverted commas, they're you forget that the engine that's driving everything comes from within, and if the heart is suffering from other things, external pressures, anxiety about the economy and economics and finances and the state of the world and climate change and all of these external pressures, which just push down and make you think, well, what is the world tomorrow going to look like? I 100% get it. Like, how do you then focus on the long term, and how do you put it then into perspective? It's difficult. You lose a sense of perspective when there's all of this other stuff going on externally.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as artists, one of the biggest skills that people need to learn or have to learn is ways that they can reground themselves and be kind to themselves and allow themselves to actually be in those feelings for a while, but not allow it to totally consume us. And I don't have the answers for that, unfortunately. It's a process that, you know, I'm having to learn, and I think a lot of people who are embarking on a career as a photographer or anything in the creative arts, you know, it's the type of thing that we should be teaching in art schools in a way, is resilience and how
Yes.
to deal with it, like methods of dealing with it.
Yeah, and you know, you mentioned other circumstances there. I think that's the thing that's most unusual about the situation we're in now. Is I think even if people have faced up to it or not, they are aware of all kinds of existential threats at the moment that are clouding the picture as well. That make it, you know, I know people. You know, these are huge topics, and I talk about them a lot on Twitter because I feel that that's important too. But I think that's probably all I need to say about it at the moment, and within the context of this chat we're having here, is that yes, whether people have faced up to the full facts about it yet or not, they're nevertheless aware that there's so many forces at play. You know, whether it's the climate crisis, AI, war, all of these things are very, very stressful. And you know, when we come down to it, we're not designed to know all this stuff. We're not designed to know all the stuff that's happening beyond our own village or our own suburb. But because of social media, which we use in other ways, and because of the way the news works these days, it means we are, you know, there's this fire hose of information. That means we're not having to, but it means many of us are contending with these other existential forces at play as well. And it's like never before, perhaps, has the future felt so uncertain. You know, these are stressful
Having our
times.
processes overloaded, basically.
Exactly.
We're faced with so many things that we
Yes.
just don't know how to cope with it ultimately.
Yeah. And the best suggestion I've seen of late is actually my I take Mondays off Twitter. I call them Bubble Mondays, just to give myself some headspace at least once a week. But my last tweet before I signed off last night was a quote by Professor Elliot Jacobson, who's a climate scientist, who simply said, "Be kind, be generous, be of service." And I think that's a great sentiment to carry forward. And I think if any artists can incorporate these vital messages into their work, I think that's a vital thing to do as well, to use their special skills of recording our beautiful world to remind people what a beautiful world we have, and to do their best with that. You know, and the ways that I've been of service of late are many-fold, but one of them is I've started a community radio show, and I talk about these things on community radio with a friend of mine, and that's been fantastic, just to offer ways of discussion and further ways of discussion, and to get feedback from people about that is an extraordinary thing. You know, to know that we are helping people by discussing these things.
Well, I mean, for me as an external person looking at your project as well, as a kind of whole that it currently is, obviously we know it's not finished. The essence of the work to me speaks of community and service. That is what the RNLI is, and this is what you're championing by photographing them and setting them in stone for prosperity. But it ultimately, you know, society needs good role models, and you are putting these people on a pedestal that they deserve to be put on, because what they stand for by doing what they're doing, by volunteering and putting themselves at risk for others, is what more people in this world need to look up to and respect. Because at the moment, without wanting to sound like a zealot, I believe we're worshipping false idols, and the people that we need to be looking towards are the people that do these kind of quiet, unbidden projects that don't get the thanks for it that they deserve.
Exactly, Greg. And you know, if there's one word that sums it up for me, is community. That's the one thing that we need right now at all levels to carry us forward in life, is community. And you know, another thing that I hope I've shown with the Lifeboat Station Project so far, something that I've determinedly done in the last few years particularly, is to show photographers that there's another way. We don't have to be commissioned. Commission yourself. If you have a good idea, commission yourself to do it and work out how you can make it happen, whether it's selling postcard packs or reminding people on social media, which is really important, that this done, you may be entertained free of charge, but it doesn't come for free.
Mm-hmm.
And offer them ways to let them support you. So I hope it's been of service in that way as well. Not only to document people who are serving over self, but to I feel so passionately about it within the realms of the photographic industry that's been so prescribed within many conventions that I'm not entirely comfortable with in many ways, and always trying to kind of break away from that model and show people another way. So I hope that anybody listening will take that from it as well. And I'm not hiding anything either. Just look at the website and see how I've built it and how I've structured it all. That's how I do it. Mm-hmm. See how you can apply that to your own work and see how you might commission yourself to have a great idea.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to kind of bring our discussion today to a close. I mean, obviously, before we go, we always ask our listeners about their desert island camera and their desert island photo book. So I've been looking forward to hearing what these might be for you. Well,
this might be a total surprise, and I kind of alluded to it before. If you take the camera first.
Yeah. It's not going to be an iPhone, is it?
It is.
Don't let me down now.
No. It is. It is my iPhone, and I hope it isn't. I really hope that. I sincerely hope that isn't letting you down, because actually, all the color pictures on my any color photographs you see to do with the project, any color postcard packs, they're all from my iPhone. And I love photography in whatever form it takes. You see, I love the storytelling aspect of it, and the only two cameras I've used for the last 10 years are my 12 by 10 inch plate camera and my iPhone. That's all I've used. And the fact is that people do have these in their pockets. And this is the reason, one of the really important things I think about this is the reason why we get to know the truth about what's happening about so many scenarios in the world, is because of people's first-hand documentation of it, because they're able to.
Very good point.
And that's what I've loved about the Lifeboat Station Project. So many of the colour pictures and behind-the-scenes moments I've been able to make because I've just had, the classic thing, the best camera is the one you have with you. And that's what I've always have with me. And when you extrapolate that, I love that we're actually able to know the truth of certain situations because of what people on the ground in those scenarios have actually witnessed and documented and shared with the world, all from one device. I do think they are incredible. I know there are great other cameras. No,
but that's a very good and interesting philosophical take on the question. I like it. I actually wouldn't have expected anything less.
Here it is. I hope you forgive me for
You're forgiven.
Because I imagine there'll be people listening rolling their eyes, going, "Oh gosh, an iPhone." But they smartphones. It doesn't. Other brands are available. They're powerful objects that have placed image making in the hands of millions of people, and I think that's a vital thing.
Yes,
the way the world is going, not just a luxury. It's a vital thing that we know the truth of certain scenarios.
Okay, and what about your book?
Right, the book, I have it just here. It's Elsick Kids by Tish Merther.
Okay.
Do you know Tish Merther?
I know the name, yeah.
Right.
It's good because we've not had this suggestion on before, and it's always nice to have a new one on and bring people's work. Elswick Kids. Tish Merther, she passed away recently, am I right?
Yes, a few years ago. And there's a paragraph here in the foreword. Shall I read it to you? That I think sums it up. Occasionally you come across a photographer who had the foresight to capture the everyday things around them, the scenes that people take for granted as somehow constant and not worthy of record. Tish Merther was one of those, a photographer who had an innate understanding that if you photograph the ordinary things, time will eventually make these images extraordinary. And she was a woman who was extraordinarily talented and worked against the odds within the photographic fraternity, within the photographic, very male-dominated arena. And there's been a film released about her recently called Tish, and I was lucky enough to go to it, to go to the crew and family opening at Tyneside Cinema here in Newcastle upon Tyne. And what I loved about it, about the opening, about the premiere, was that I didn't go because I'm a photographer. I went because my wife has become, over the years, friends with Tish's daughter Ella through Instagram, just through connections there. And I went because I was my wife's plus one at the premiere. And when you looked around at the premiere, it was people, it was folk. It wasn't the great and good of photography, it was folk. And when you then watched the film, I cried from beginning to end. And I really recommend that people, if they see a screening coming up of it locally, that you see it. And there'll be some surprises in it as well, I'll tell you, that really welcome surprises. I can't really say any more than that. You must see the film. But she really struggled in the photographic arena and was at times squashed because, well, for many reasons, a woman documenting real life in Elsick, the life that she knew, we have the gatekeepers of photography and people deciding what's good and what's not. And now to think that since her death, Tate have now acquired her work speaks volumes that that kind of thing didn't necessarily happen perhaps as much as it should do when she was alive, and she died in poverty. And it's one of the saddest tales you'll ever hear, and a real emotional roller coaster. But I really recommend people buy that book and read the words and look at the images, because it's life. We've talked about frameworks being erased, and the last year in particular being very difficult for people. And when you look back at those pictures of childhood in particular through the 1970s and 1980s, for many people of a certain age, like my age, it will strike a chord, and it will remind you of the path that's led to the life we're in now, and also of a female photographer who found it so hard to show such brilliant work in a male-dominated arena. So see her work, see the film if you possibly can, and that'll be my Desert Island book to remind me of life.
Oh,
lovely.
Well, that is very. That's a fantastic recommendation. So thank you very much. We'll link to the film, information about the film in the show notes, actually, and obviously the link to the book will also be in there. Jack, I mean, that was a fantastic chat. We're so glad that you were able to make it onto the show.
Absolutely.
We could have talked for another hour at least. Honestly, there's so much more I wanted to ask you about, and I'm just incredibly grateful that you were able to come on and you were able to be so open with us, because it really, really matters for people to hear this.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for allowing me to speak so openly, because as you can no doubt tell, these things are important to me to express, because I think we need to all help one another in this community to carry ourselves forward.
Yeah, well, we're very grateful.
Thank you.
Excellent.
So if people want to find out more about you, your work, and the project, I know we've mentioned the web address, but we always do a sum up. Where's the best place to find you on Twitter, the website, Instagram?
Yes, so the best place to find the work is lifeboatstationproject.com, all one word, or you could just web search Lifeboat Pictures Jack Lowe, and I'm sure it'll come up, Lowe with an E. And if people would like to follow on Twitter, they can. You'll see that my personal feed ain't an easy ride. Mr. Jack Lowe on Twitter, but also Project Lifeboat for the Lifeboat Station Project specifically. So those are the places you can immediately be in touch and find out, the place for all these things. One thing we didn't mention, by the way, was that I also make audio recordings. So people should look for those things on the website as well. I'm not just a photographer. I consider myself a documentarist. So there are audio recordings and even short films to find on the website as well.
Oh, lovely.
Amazing.
Perfect. Well, that's going to be my evening.
Good.
Thank you again, Jack, for coming on.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Greg and Tom. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much for listening to the latest episode of the Exposed Negative podcast. If you'd like to support the show, you can do that by heading to our Patreon or doing one-offs. The details are on the website, and the Patreon is patreon.com/exposed negative. We'd love it if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/@exposed negative. And obviously, we're on Instagram, which is xnegative. If you want to follow us personally, mine is tombarnes.com on Instagram, and the website. And then Greg's is @GregFennell, and that's FUNNELL. So, thank you very much for taking the time to listen, and hopefully you enjoy the next one.